All right, now that we have set this stage with looking at how to set up basic settings sections, we could get into the fun part, which are the fields themselves. So let's come and activate our plugin here, Settings Fields, and come onto our settings page. Now notice that we have our settings section, which we set up before, but now we have this field here called custom text, and we could save some text there, and it will save in the database in the options table for us. So let's take a look at how all of this is working behind the scenes. Okay, coming into our main plugin file, we could see that it's set up just like before, settings fields and our menu, nothing else going on. So if we come into our settings fields, we have the same thing going on before, sort of. We're hooking into admin init, and we have our settings function here, and we're adding this section. So this is what we looked at previously. Now this other stuff is going to be the new stuff. So let's take a look at that now. First of all, we've seen a block of code like this before. This is basically saying if a setting in the options table doesn't exist called WP plugin settings, go ahead and create it. And we're not actually putting anything in it, we're just leaving it empty, but we're making sure that it's there so that when updates run later, it's automatically there. So that's the first step we're going to do. Then we set up our section, we've already looked at that, and now we could set up our field. So just like before, we saw a unique identifier, so we're calling this custom text. You could call it footer text if you were doing something like that. You could call it first name, last name, etc., etc. So something that works well for you but is unique, and try to not get into patterns where you're just giving things random names and you can't tell later on what they are, because that's important. Okay, next we have the field title. Notice that when we just call add settings field and we enter in this text here as the second parameter, we're automatically going to get this label here. And behind the scenes, this is actually building a table out, and as WordPress changes its markup, it would build out whatever interface matched the WordPress editing experience. But we get all of this for free, including having our content exported out right here. So that's just a little benefit to working with the settings API and what the second parameter does. Next, we have a callback field for the markup. Now, it would be great if WordPress automatically built us the field that we want, but what we'll see if we come down to this is that we have to do a little bit of work ourselves. We're going to get the specific option that we want, check to see if the custom text is set it if it is, and then build out our form or our input field ourselves, including adding the text. So let's come back to this in a moment, but this is just to point out that when we create a settings field, unfortunately, we do have to create the markup for it ourselves as well. And that may change in the future, but that is the case now. So the next thing about the settings field is we have to tell it what page to go on and what section to go in. So now we see why it's important that we know what our pages are, as well as the various sections that exist. And because we are doing this for ourselves and we already set up a section already in the last lesson, then we're just going to add it to that. So the last piece is registering our setting. The nice thing is that if we build a settings field like this, we can, in our form, automatically save that data into our own variable. So this is going to be how we set it up. WP plugin settings is the group, and then the specific setting that we're registering. It is possible to hook into other people's settings, and that's where you would change the first parameter. But again, in this example, which is probably going to be most common, we're just hooking into our own settings. So this code will work for us. And then again, we're hooking into admin init. So I know that this is a lot to first take in, but these are the steps that we need to go through for adding a settings field. We're going to make sure that an option exists in the database called WP plugin settings. We're going to set up our settings field, and then we're going to register our settings, which looks kind of duplicate in this case because of how we're naming things. But this is a general pattern you could use on your own as well. And like we saw on the front end, what this is going to give us is a row here with some custom text that is automatically going to be saved in the database for us. So let's take a look at how that is being saved real quick. I'm going to come into my options table, and I'm just going to do a quick search for my WP plugin settings real quick. Okay, here we go. So notice that we have an array saved with a string of custom text, so that's what I'm saving it as, and I'll show you how that is done, and then the text itself. So this is what WP plugin settings is going to be saved as, and then as we added more fields, or as we add more fields, we will see them automatically added here as well. So the way we can get this out is by referencing custom text, and let's look at where we specify that and how it's saved. So let's come back into our code, and for the settings field, let's look specifically at this callback function. Now this may get a little laborious and you'll learn some shortcuts around this, but basically for each field we set up, we need to set up the markup for it as well. So really all that we technically need is this code right here where we're echoing out an input field. However, because we want to display the current value, we need to do a little bit more work instead. So let's go ahead and walk through this. So first of all, we're getting all of our WP plugin settings, which is going to be an array of data. Then we're setting up a new variable called custom text, which is empty to start. And then we're going to look inside of our options and see if custom text exists. Now, how we save this as custom text is actually down here. So we'll get to that in a second, but just the logic here should make sense that we're checking to see if options custom text is set. And if it is, we will escape that content and go ahead and save that as custom text. So basically this is get the options, set custom text to blank. If custom text exists as an option, go ahead and set it here so that by the time we get to our form, we're either going to echo out something blank or we're going to echo out what actually exists in the database. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully as well you know your HTML form, so we have an input field with text. We're setting a unique ID. This is going to be whatever you want to set it as, but it's a good idea to namespace it and then give it a name specific to what it is, like first name, last name, etc. Then this part right here is actually how it's going to be saved in the database. So this is super important, and it's important to point out that we could set up a settings field here, but nowhere in here is the name for how it's saved in the database. And to show you what I mean, if we come back here into the database, notice WP plugin settings, custom text. Where does this come from? How do we get this name? And that's really important because if we ever want to get that data out of there, the settings API knows how to do it, but we have to actually specifically tell it to. So let's look at this custom text. Notice for the name, we have WP plugins, and then inside of square brackets, we have the word custom text. This is where it's all going to actually be set. Let me bring this up a bit. So if you're not familiar with PHP forms, when you have the ID or the attribute name and the content is submit to the server side via hitting the submit button, this name value becomes a variable that the server has access to. So what WordPress is doing is as soon as this field is submit, it's automatically figuring out, okay, this is going to go inside WP plugin settings with the name of custom text. And then the value that is entered as the value of the field, that's what's going to be the name or the value of it. So if we were to change this to custom text field, then in the database, we would actually see custom text field appear here. However, because somebody had already saved something with custom text, you'd probably see that still appear there as well. So once you come up with your names, you don't want to change them too much because you may get some other data in there than what you're expecting. However, it's really important to understand that this right here that we have to code ourselves is what is going to determine the name in the database. However, if we do it properly, what's going to happen is if they have a value for this saved already, which we have pulled out as custom text here, right? So the name this matches this. If we echo that out, then that will already be there. And when they save it, it will automatically be saved. So this is the last step to the settings API. And like I said, it would be great if we could just say, hey, give me an input field and it would do this automatically, but it doesn't. So you might be asking, why don't I just code all this myself? And there are still some benefits. Notice that nowhere are we saying update setting, right? We're just setting a settings field and then we're building the form, but we're still not having to do the server-side handling. And as I mentioned previously, if we come into our templates, this action options.php, WordPress is automatically going to know we submitted a settings field. It's going to know what settings map to what in the database, and it will automatically handle all of that for us. Now, in order for that to be handled, In addition to the do settings sections, which we already looked at, we have to talk about now the settings fields and the submit button. So setting fields is going to insert in a couple of hidden fields, and this is what is going to give WordPress extra information about what is being submitted, as well as some good security measures to make sure that the person really has access to change these and something isn't being done nefariously. So let's come back to our settings field with this set up and open up our inspector to look at the form behind the scenes. Okay, so notice that we have a form here, and then we see our settings section, and then we see a table, and inside the table we have rows that have our input fields. Now, what of this did we code ourselves? We coded in the form, and then we coded in the closing form and the submit button. Everything else was done by settings fields and settings sections. So now let's separate what setting fields does and what setting sections is doing. So we have the submit button, we saw that. Setting sections is going to, see how this comment here, display the setting sections, that's where it starts. It displays the H2 in the description, and then it will automatically, all the fields will determine what goes in this table here. And as I mentioned, WordPress uses a table for consistency here, but this will likely change as the admin continues to evolve in WordPress, but we could trust that our content will be put out, our settings fields will be put out in whatever way makes most sense there. So we could see that we coded that, so that's the settings section. But before that are all these input type hidden fields. So options page, value WP plugin settings. So this is telling us, okay, we are working with our plugin settings. Like I said, it will know what content we're working with via this line here, and that gets generated automatically. It also knows that we are going to be updating some settings. Remember in our code, we had that conditional content that made sure that our settings was added so that later on we could just update fine. And then we have a nonce, or a number used once, and this is a random number generated when this form was built or when this form was rendered to the page from the server that has this inside of it. And WordPress needs to have this sent back in the same format in order to work. And this prevents somebody from trying to just submit a field programmatically and not have the proper permissions. And then it's also going to tell us the referrer so that it knows exactly what page it was on when this was submitted. So all of this data is being set up automatically for us when we use the settings field and tell it for WP plugin settings. Now, if we were to remove this and try to submit our, or we don't want to remove it, if we were to remove it this way and try to submit our field, we would get errors and it would not work. So you definitely want to include that, especially because of the security and all the other information, and that's what allows everything to work. However, it's pretty nice that our form itself is nice and clean. We don't have anything extra here. All of it is within our settings fields here. Now, just like we have our templates for settings page, it is possible if you wanted to break this out and have that be in its own template somewhere. Maybe it's reusable and you could pass it in parameters. And as we get into looking at more and more fields and you build larger settings pages, you'll definitely want to architect this a little bit differently. However, at this point, what you should be comfortable with is setting up a new field, making sure that your front-end template has the content it needs, and you're building the callback function in a way so that you echo out a field as well as populate it with what has already been saved there if there is something. So like I said, this is a lot. Try to play around and get comfortable with this, and what we'll do in the next lesson is go and look at how to add a bunch of other types of setting fields, and by the time you get comfortable playing around with all those, you should be able to get this pattern down pretty well and be comfortable building your own settings pages. So look through this code, try to make some of your own changes, try to duplicate this on your own in your own plugin, and then we'll look at how to add more settings fields and different types of fields in the next lesson.